This is a production of PBS Charlotte.
Just ahead, please join me for a crucial conversation on race, fairness, and justice. Carolina Impact's special Seeking Unity starts now.
PBS Charlotte presents a special Carolina Impact, Seeking Unity.
Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Amy BURKETT. Welcome to our special Carolina Impact Seeking Unity. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." We've seen the protests across the country and right here in Charlotte in response to the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. There is outrage, shock, and a call for justice. Now, every culture and religion believes in the golden rule. Treat people the way you would like to be treated. It sounds so simple, but unfortunately our nation has been unable to live out those profound words. Let's use this as a common starting point for our conversation and shine light into the dark corners of racism. Before I introduce our panel tonight, I want to ask you to show us all grace. Every word out of our mouths may not be perfect, but we are here to promote understanding and truly seek unity to help our community heal. So, here's our panel. Bishop Claude Alexander, Senior Pastor of the Park Church, the largest black church in Charlotte, and one of the largest churches in the city. Next, we have David Chadwick, Senior Pastor at Moments of Hope Church, a veteran of the city's faith community. And also, Dr. Julia Robinson Moore from UNC Charlotte. She is a professor of African American religion and racial violence in America. She's also an ordained minister and author. Next, let's meet Jim Noble, executive chef and owner of Noble Foods and Pursuits. He has 7 restaurants. One of those is King's Kitchen in Uptown. He invests all the profits from that restaurant into the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Dream Center, serving the homeless community in Center City. Jim is also an ordained minister. While our panelists represent some of the faith community, this is not intended to be a religious conversation, but one focused on our humanity. Let's begin by hearing each of your thoughts on what has brought us to this heart-wrenching time in our history.
Once again, we're coming to terms with race and racism having been and continuing to be a part of the American fabric and culture. There's never been a time when America has not had to deal with racism because it was born within that. 157 years before the birth of the country, the transatlantic slave trade established the view of Africans as property, and that was codified in the Constitution with Africans and their descendants, 3/5 human. And the role of law enforcement for 350 of those years was to keep African Americans in their place. Thus, we are seeing this play itself out again.
Pastor Chadwick, your perspective?
Well, I believe with all my heart that empathy is the pathway to progress. And until we can empathize with what others feel, we can't move forward. I think a large number of white people really can't empathize with what Claude just referred to, being declared 3/5 human, Jim Crow's laws, redlining, which prevented basic services from getting to certain communities simply because of the color of their skin, to not having adequate education, segregation, all of those things. And for those of us who are white, we need to pause and try to place ourselves in the skin of African Americans who've had that kind of systemic racism since the day they were born. Indeed, since the day our nation was born.
Dr. Moore, you study this. Is your perspective different from being in academia?
So I wear 2 hats. I'll certainly wear my academic hat today. The question for me has always been, yes, there's been racism, there's been longstanding racism in our country, but how has the church been complicitous in that racism? And so while I am a hard dyed-in-the-wool Christian, I do take a very critical eye at the complicity of American evangelicalism, as well as the Protestant and Catholic churches and their complicity in the history of systemic racism. So I'll speak more to that as we move forward.
I would like to have just a hair of clarity about that a little bit now so that we don't miss it, so
okay.
we understand that perspective.
So, if you look at who were the slave owners in America, if I go back to the comments from my colleagues earlier, who were the slave owners? Who were the people that were able to benefit from the institution of slavery? We cannot distract or take out Christianity from those people who were benefiting from slavery. Many of your slave owners, especially here in the city of Charlotte, were Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, Catholics. Many of them were Christians. In fact, you cannot even talk about slavery without talking about the missionary that was on the slave ship, without talking about the ways in which Christianity shaped the institution of slavery. So that's what I mean in that respect.
Thank you. Jim, I want to hear your perspective of what has brought us to this point.
The thing you mentioned when we first started about the golden rule and loving our fellow man as ourselves. And that does not mean loving the fellow man that's your same color as you, but loving everybody the same as you love the Lord. I think there's, you can love people and not love God, but it'd be hard to love God and not love people. And I think we really have to take a look at this. I think we need to sit it down. Even today, Sundays at 11 o'clock is probably the most segregated hour. That's not the way heaven is. That's not the way the body of Christ should be.
Help us just take a moment, and I want to throw this out for anyone who wants to respond. We have seen protests before, but many people agree that this feels very different. I'd love your perspective on what makes this a little different than what we've seen in the past.
Maybe I could jump in first, just because I think I'm the older statesman of the group here today. I'm 70 years old, and I can remember vividly the 60s, 1965, the Watts riots, the 1967, the long summer, which erupted into hostilities and racial riots all throughout our nation. Martin Luther King's assassination in 1968. I was a junior in college when that happened, and that caused 10 major cities in America to have 10 days of race riots. I feel like I'm living almost in Groundhog Day, because this thing keeps happening over and over and over again. And I think what makes this one worse, though, is two words: social media. We can now film it. Everybody can see it immediately. It can go all around the world. So the feelings of anger are immediately exacerbated more than previous decades.
I would also add, I think that we are in a Birmingham 1963 moment. Namely, meaning when people saw German shepherds and fire hoses being unleashed on children, elderly, just because they were marching. Those who were on the fence saw the absolute violence of racism, and they could not deny it. We saw 8 minutes. Nobody can deny the absolute violence of that. And those who were on the fence before because they couldn't see that are now propelled into decisions and action. And I think that's why the protests have been much more inclusive than they were before.
Other perspectives?
I agree that the night that this happened, on the night that it was on the news on Memorial Day, the fact that the man sat there with his knee on his neck and killed him just right in front of view for all humanity. That's not the first time this has happened, but this is the first time we've seen it like this. And for a lot of people who don't think they know they think they know what's going on, they really don't. And I can explain sometime from the way I was raised in my church. It was a predominantly black church. And to go travel and to check in hotels, I saw prejudice. I was treated differently than other folks in line checking in the hotel. So there's stuff out there that you don't even know going on. And this brought it to light, and people could see cold blood murder on TV.
Jim, it's an interesting thought that you bring up, the fact that you were raised in a black church. Is that one of the things that has shaped what you're showing us, your heart to help others?
I was raised in First Methodist Church, but when we spiritually came alive, I ended up going to a church in Winston-Salem to hear a speaker, and it was a black church, and I never left. I was there since 94, and now I pastor a church uptown, but he's still my pastor. And he told me, he said, "Noble, you're a pioneer. There's a lot of black men will follow a white pastor, but not many white men will follow a black pastor." And that's true. But it was not a race thing to me. It was a spiritual thing to me. And he spoke into my life, and I saw someone pastor as a pastor, and I realized that it's a different world for the Black Americans than it is for the white Americans.
And Dr. Moore, your thoughts?
Well, I was just thinking about what my colleagues have said, and yes, George Floyd's death was certainly filmed, and for us to see the horrific tragedy that happened to him. But there's been other incidents where African American peoples have been brutalized and beaten, and it's been on film, it's been videotaped, but we haven't had the kind of response that we've had now. So I think we have this sort of coalescence of the fallout from the COVID-19, which has disproportionately affected African American communities and people of color, plus the added police brutality and violence that we've seen from Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. I could even go back to Michael Brown, Philando Castile, and name many others. Rekia Boyd, all of these things have sort of just been a sort of pressure cooker, bringing African Americans and people of other races more aware of what's been happening. I think even I can go back to Rodney King when we had over 8 minutes and 46 seconds of him being beaten, and still not have the kind of corporate response that we have across race and ethnicities that we have today. So I think that the COVID virus and where we are today, and certainly the ways in which the surveillance that we have in terms of our phones, we have now a greater voice to sort of speak about the atrocities that have been happening to people of color. So,
now, Bishop Alexander, you shared with our producer in advance of this conversation that you often feel like you're just one traffic stop, one wrong place, one wrong time away from getting killed as a Black man in this country. Help us understand that you, in a leadership role, highly esteemed in our community, people need to understand why that is so real, because perhaps they don't realize it.
Well, yeah, I mean, before people know all of that about me, they see me as an African American male. I don't have all of those things on my forehead. Right? I wish I could, but the point being is that when Amy Cooper said an African American male was going to make that false action, every African American male in that vicinity was put in jeopardy of being handcuffed, or at the worst killed. That could happen anywhere, and that could happen to me. And so that's what I mean.
How do we make things better in our country? And Dr. Moore, if you want to start with that, it would be great.
I do. I actually want to build on the bishop's explanation, because when I heard that, I'm a mother of a 22-year-old, or 21, I'm going to be 22-year-old African-American male. And so for every mother of a male child of color, just fear and just the incredulous that someone would just automatically play that race card, knowing how many young African-American males they would put in jeopardy. And as a mother, to have that conversation with your son about, here yet again, I have to tell you that you have to be especially careful because you're walking around in your Black skin. One of the solutions to those kinds of things, I believe, is educating people to say that those words, whenever they're trying to play what we consider the race card, or whenever they're trying to work on historic stereotypes of African American males that are totally unfounded, they need to be educated to say that this is not right, this is not how you classify individuals, and that people need to be aware of these long-standing historic stereotypes of African American males and women that have been in our America's consciousness forever, that need to be dismantled and confronted.
Other conversations, other thoughts about how we can get to solutions, rather.
Well, I believe with all of my heart that if indeed empathy is the pathway to progress, that we just need to go sit down with an African-American person, hopefully a friend, and just ask them, tell us your experience, and listen to times they've been profiled. Listen to times when they've had someone follow them in a department store for no reason whatsoever. Listen, understand, and try to empathize, put yourself in their skin. And I think that's the beginning point for trying to understand, which if you can get a collective group that understands, then maybe you can start making different changes in the societal culture.
So yes, empathy, awareness, and then looking at what can I do within the grid of my influence. So Jim is a perfect example of that, how he's using what he does every day to make a statement, to issue change. That can be done by everyone. Everyone can assume that level of responsibility. And then supporting procedures and policies that affirm human dignity and create opportunity for all people.
I also think having conversations at home, so many times when these conversations come up, the society looks for African American or people of color to bring all the education. These kinds of conversations should be happening among white people within their families. And so I think it starts at the dinner table. I think it starts when you hear grandma or grandpa who say racist things or say pejorative things about people of color, and how families begin to have these conversations. It starts within churches where elders and deacon boards who are predominantly white begin to have conversations among themselves about any kind of racial paradigm that they may have experienced growing up or have learned of, and to have those conversations. Yeah.
You bring up an interesting point about conversations at the dinner table. I have a 19-year-old who just went off to college last year, and it was hard to have dinner time because they were in this sport or this after-school activity, or today it seems that a part of our society does not have those. It's very difficult. And my son even told me, he goes, "Mom, we're the only people in the school that you make me sit down and have dinner with you and talk." I don't understand. I mean, that seems like if we're missing that, to your point, Dr. Moore, how do we get our society back to those just good conversations?
Well, we put our time in what we value. And so if society, especially Charlotte society, if Charlotte society values a more humane, equitable community and neighborhoods, they need to make time for these kinds of conversations, and make time for these conversations in a very loving way. This is not where we're trying to accuse and create massive amounts of guilt. This is a time where we're trying to create community across cultures for conversation, for healing and hope. And so I think we just need to make the time to do it.
I don't think it'll happen without a change of heart. And a change of heart would be an introspective, godly look at yourself according to how he commands us to live. And consider those other than yourself, and put others before yourself. After the last riots in 2016, I went to so many meetings where people wanted to get involved and do something. And then after a few months, it just kind of fell away. And we asked people, come help us, because we go into these neighborhoods every Saturday and reach into places where people are in tough places. And it really is a place for the body of Christ to come together as one. But to getting people to take an action is tough. And people are going to have to make up their mind that they want to do something different about it. They may think, well, I'm not doing anything wrong, but they don't really understand that sometimes they are carrying on traditions from their forefathers without even knowing it.
How do we get the thought across to everyone that everyone plays a role? And even that someone mentioned that we all have influence, whether it's from our church, our Bible study, a book club, a neighborhood watch group. How do we express to everyone that for us to make it to an improved, better living situation for all citizens, to truly practice that golden rule, that everyone needs to do something?
Well, I think this notion of interdependence, interconnection, common destiny, that's what you're really talking about. And I don't know if that is an intentional part of people's thinking every day. But if that can be a part of people's thinking, then I realize that my thriving, my flourishing is dependent upon someone else thriving and flourishing. that I have an equal responsibility to helping them thrive and flourish. I think that's a good start.
I would add to that too, Claude, that Jesus' command to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and might, and your neighbor as yourself, for everybody to realize we all love ourselves. We feed ourselves, we entertain ourselves, we clothe ourselves. To love other people with that same kind of intensity. And then Jesus was asked the question, well, who's my neighbor? And his answer was basically, yes, all those around you. So spend each day looking for a neighbor. It might be someone next door. It might be someone in the inner city, but find a neighbor that you could love just this day. And if you would take that one step, I think that would make a huge difference in moving our city forward.
I also want to add that, for so many people, they think racism or systemic inequalities is just the problem of one group or one ethnicity. But racism and inequality is a problem for everybody. And I think once we change that paradigm and say, oh, this is not about those people, this is about me. And we begin to take up our stories and connect them to other people's stories and realize how much we are truly connected. So if a unrest is going to happen in one part of the city of Charlotte, it's going to affect another part, whether we know the people or not. And we need to begin to realize how deeply connected we are, and that any kind of problem in one part is going to affect the whole part of our community.
And let me say one more thing too, because you brought up something earlier about the church, and the church is not have a beautiful past. But the church, led by the doctrines of Jesus Christ, can change the world. Without that, this problem will not be solved. Racism is going on even in Jesus' days between the Jews and Samaritans. So if we do not look towards God to change us, and I don't mean the church of my grandparents or their great-grandparents, I'm talking about the doctrines and the teachings that he gave us. If we don't walk by that, we don't have a solution on this earth.
Yeah, I think there are two forms of Christianity in operation, not just in the city of Charlotte, but all over the world. We have that traditional Christianity that came from the legacies of slavery, from Jim Crow, and for segregation. And that was sort of built into the theology and doctrine of the church. Whereas we have the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is the truth that is always about community and loving one's neighbor. So I think that we need to take a look. The church actually needs to look at the Christianity that they have allowed culture to sort of disrupt and corrupt, and look at the truths of the gospel, which is actually about loving your neighbor as yourself.
And Julie, I would add to that, you were so right that so sadly that there were ministers and slave owners who used the scripture to continue slavery. But you also need to admit too that there were a number of Christians who, like Harriet Tubman and others, helped lead African Americans out of slavery. And, Jesus made it clear there are wheat and tares in the church. There are people who claim to be Christians, but they're not any more Christians than the man in the moon, any more than living in a garage makes you an automobile. And there are also those who really do love Jesus. So like Jim and Claude, I would just call all of us who love Jesus to come together and say, no more. We're not going to put up with this racism anymore, and we're going to be the true body of Christ. The heart of the matter is a matter of the heart, and we would proclaim the true gospel of Jesus, which changes the heart, which allows us to love everyone.
No more. I love the sounds of that. No more to racism. No more to hate. No more to injustice. Unfortunately, my new friends, we are out of time for right now. But I want to thank each of you so much for sharing. This is just the tip of the iceberg. This is just starting conversations. But we are so very grateful to each and every one of you for being a part of this conversation. I'd like to leave you with this quote from Fred Rogers, who hosted Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood here on PBS. In times of stress, the best thing we can do for each other is to listen with our ears and our hearts, and to be assured that our questions are just as important as our answers. Let's all keep asking questions and practicing the golden rule. Thank you for joining us for this special Carolina Impact Seeking Unity. Good night, my friends.
A production of PBS Charlotte.